As everybody's coming in, if you hear the beautiful birds singing in the background, I want everyone to know that this is not a track that we planted. This is our expert panelist from Hawaii's real background every day while he works. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you are just joining now and you haven't had a chance to fill this out, I'm going to ask everyone to go ahead right now, and you can use the QR code on your phone to go to menti.com, where we'll have everybody answer a couple questions about themselves so that we can learn a bit about each other, and we will share the results at the end of the event. Go ahead and fill it out on your own time. Just do make sure that you stop after the first 6 questions and pause at the pause here spot, because after that, the portions of that Menti poll are meant to be completed during the tasting. There we go. All right, so thank you everybody for coming. It's great to have you here. Today, we're going to talk about the geology of coffee. Now, before we talk too much about the event or the panelists, since everybody came with their coffee hot and ready to taste, we're going to start immediately with coffee tasting. Once we finish this first coffee tasting portion, we will move forward into introducing the event and the panelists. And if you're not ready and you don't have your coffee ready yet, don't worry, we will have a point within the middle of the event where we'll give you time to brew your coffee a second time and we'll taste a second time. But since our coffee's hot right now, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to one of our expert panelists, Gemma.
Hey everyone. All right then. So, I mean, if you've got a hot cup of coffee right now, you've already kind of skipped this first step, but you know, this will be good for future reference, to basically smell the beans as you're going through the process. If you've got whole beans, smell them, you know, straight out the bag, smell them once they've been ground. And then if you're doing a pour over, whether it be a Kalita wave, a V60 or a French press, kind of inhale that first bloom, the wetting of the grounds that you do. That's, you know, the third kind of sense of smell of the beans. And then before you take your first sip, tilt that cup back and just before you taste it, get that sensory smell for the fourth one. And they'll all be slightly different, but this is just basically gearing your brain up to, you know, what you're going to be able to taste within that coffee. You know, it's not going to be just coffee. It's going to be some interesting stuff in there. And so then we get the fun bit. Now we get to taste the coffee. So start with a tiny sip at first, and just let that kind of ruminate in your mouth and see what it kind of comes out with. And then take a more extended slurp, kind of aerating the coffee in a similar way that they do when they kind of sip wine, and get it around the entire surface of your tongue and see if you can see anything different that you got to that first sip. And then the third sip will be a kind of a smaller follow-up sip, kind of close your eyes and focus on the actual flavors, and then start to see, okay, can we start to identify what kind of sweetness are we looking at? You know, are we looking at a brown sugar or a molasses or a honey? Is there any acidity or brightness to this coffee? You know, is it a fruity one? Whether that be citrus, blueberries, watermelon, it can even be tomato. There's some coffees that come from Kenya that do taste like tomato. You shouldn't be tasting it in either of the Ethiopian or the Colombian ones you're trying today, but just something to note for future tastings. And then the body, is the body heavy? Is it light? And then what's the kind of cleanliness of that on your palate as you come towards the end? Is it acidic? Is it a more neutral one? And these are all the things that you can consider when you're tasting coffee. And so starting with the Ethiopian coffee, just kind of have a think about, you know, what flavors you're potentially picking up in terms of, you know, that sweetness, that, you know, what kind of acidity is coming in. And that's where you'll be able to kind of drop some ideas into the Menti poll, and we'll see what everybody's kind of coming up with in terms of flavor profiles.
So at this point, you can go ahead and click past the pause here slide and add in your comments. We can build a word cloud together. Just a
Stefano,
moment.
you're going to share your screen, right?
Yeah, I just want to let a couple come in so that we.
While we're letting that go on, we are aware of the fact that for some reason our chat box and Q&A box do not seem to be working. Once Stefano is sharing his screen, then I can try to troubleshoot that. Okay. All right, thanks.
Here we go. So Gemma, you can see the word cloud.
Yeah, that's. I'm liking what I'm seeing on there. I mean, I don't want to put the cart before the horse and give everybody the answers, but we are definitely along the right lines of kind of typical Ethiopian coffee profiles.
Okay, thank
Like
you.
I said, if you're doing the mentees, just keep it going.
Keep tasting your coffee or well, enjoy your Ethiopian. Now we're going to do the Colombian.
Yep, so now we start with that Colombian. You can do a kind of a palate cleanser of a sip of water between them if you want, but you should definitely kind of have a different flavor profile coming from this. We kind of picked 2 end members that you should see, you know, enough contrasting differences, and it'll be interesting to see what comes through on the Menti poll for if we have any overlapping flavor profiles or if we have something, you know, contrastingly different.
All right, here come the Colombian entries for the Colombian coffee. Looks pretty different, Gemma.
Yeah, no, we're definitely getting you know, things on the shall I say darker end. We're getting those earthy chocolate notes, some bitter coming through there, acidic, tobacco. You can see definitely different different keywords compared to that Ethiopian. So, and it's all down to
the strawberries in this one. I guess blueberries for Ethiopia and strawberries in South America.
Yep, and that's, you know, there will be, you know, there's many different fruits that could you know, cross over those get through the coffee. You know, I know a lot of people just, you know, think coffee is coffee, but there are, you know, there's a great depth to kind of single origin beans that perhaps most don't appreciate. And, you know, you don't necessarily need any sweetener if you've got those natural fruit notes coming through. And I know that's certainly how I learned on my coffee journey. I was at a coffee training course, and they offered us black coffee, and I didn't see any cream or sugar in the room, and that was for a very specific reason. They wanted us to taste through, you know, taste the coffee and see what natural sweetness it had for itself.
I guess that's why they don't give you ice when you're wine tasting.
All right, let's get back to the slides. All right, go ahead, Gemma.
So this is just kind of a giant word cloud. Obviously looks very similar to what Stefano's had popping up in the Menti poll, but this is basically, you know, words, any words, you know, a whole host of words that can be used to describe the flavors of coffee, no matter, you know, whether it's Ethiopia or Colombia. This is just all the flavors that can potentially be picked up as you're tasting a coffee from a given area. So some of them may have, you know, blueberry, orange, bright notes. Others may have that caramel, chocolate, kind of floral finish to them. So this is, you know, just saying these are all the kind of things that you can actually pick up in a simple cup of black coffee. And I won't give away, you know, the answers, but, you know, there is a reason we chose, you know, 2 different countries to sample coffees from, like I say, to sample kind of 2 end members, 2 contrasting differences. And like I say, this whole word cloud you can pick out, and it looks very similar to that Menti poll. So everyone did a great job with their tasting. And so then this is kind of the answers. So if we'll start with Ethiopia, since that's where we started from. So people were picking up those citrus, those blueberry notes. I did see somebody put tea-like, and that is kind of a feature common in some of the Ethiopian coffees. It's definitely got a lighter body, It's not as kind of dark and opaque as you might expect coffee to look. And then on the flip side of that is that Colombian, which has the more medium bodied, has those chocolate nutty notes, a little more silky, and can have that fruity, spicy aroma. So you can see that, you know, we've got two contrasting flavor profiles, and it all comes down to personal preferences. Ethiopian coffees have gained a lot of traction in the last, you know, X many years, especially in the specialty coffee world, because they really are coming out with these, you know, blueberry forward notes. And it's not, you know, these are not flavored coffee beans. This is the natural flavor of the bean itself. They're not coated in any, you know, blueberry syrup or essence or anything else. These are the natural flavor profiles from the bean itself because of where it's grown. And same with the Colombian one. It's, you know, we're not adding, you know, we're talking about chocolate notes. We're not drinking a mocha and adding chocolate syrup. These are the natural flavors that are coming out of the beans that come from Colombia. So this is kind of one of the awesome things about coffee, is that, you know, depending on what mood you're feeling like, you can have something lighter body, tea light from Ethiopia, or something a little heavier from Colombia. Covers all the bases.
Thank you so much, Gemma. So now that you all have immediately tasted your coffee, which we wanted to do immediately while it was hot, we're going to go ahead and do some introductions so you actually know a bit about who we all are. So we cannot have this event without the help of many, 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 many people. We have a very dedicated organizing committee. Thank you all so much. We love our expert panelists, which you'll of course learn more about them as the event continues. And very behind the scenes, we have a breadth of people that work to help advertising. So I have the list of some individuals on the right, but also all of the organizing organizations listed at the bottom have also helped with preparing the event and advertising. So thank you so much to everybody. A quick agenda today. We've already done our first tasting. Not on the agenda is a lot of technical difficulties and troubleshooting, and hopefully we will get that solved, but we're going to go ahead and keep going. Right now I'm doing some quick logistics, and then we'll introduce our panelists. Then we'll have a quick lecture by Gerry. We'll go over some home brewing techniques. We'll have a second tasting and lecture by Gemma, followed by Q&A and a coffee happy hour event. So logistics for Zoom. At this point, this slide's a little bit out of date, so I'm going to go ahead and say, please interact with everybody through the Q&A box. We're going to go ahead and use that like chat box until the chat box gets fixed. And but you can also add questions in the Q&A box, and there should be an upvoting feature in there. So if you see somebody else's question and you agree that you want that question to be asked to the panelists, go ahead and upvote it. Also, if you have a question for a specific panelist, try to clarify that in the question so that we know who to direct it to during the Q&A. One additional thing, this event is being recorded and will be hosted on the AAPG Women's Network YouTube channel. So if you really enjoyed it and you just want to repeat it again with some of your friends, you will have that opportunity in the future. All right, let's finally meet our panelists. For this portion, I'm going to pass it over to one of our committee members, Kat.
Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. So today we are very lucky to be joined by two expert panelists. Both of them come from a geoscience background and or are current geoscientists. And they're coming from totally different places. We have Gemma. She is the co-owner of Cambrian Coffee in Houston, Texas, and that is a geology-themed specialty coffee shop. She's also a geologist at Chemostrat. And we have Gerry Ross, who's joining us from Hawaii. So Gerry is the co-owner of Kupa'a Farms. He is a former geologist from the Geological Survey of Canada. So I'm going to go ahead and we're going to stop sharing. And we're going to have the three of us on the screen here. And we're going to do a little bit of like a fireside chat, which just pretty much means that instead of me reading their biographies, I'm going to ask three kind of fun questions, and we get to learn a little bit more about them before they go ahead and present some fantastic content to us and guide us through this part of the webinar. So I am going to start off with a question for Gemma. So Gemma, can you share with us a little bit more about how you became a geologist?
Yeah, so I mean, as everyone can tell from my accent, I'm originally from the UK, and so it's kind of in my later high school years, was kind of studying geography at school, learning about plate tectonics, was very interested in it, and I guess that's when it first kind of occurred to me. I was like, okay, that's geology and I can go study that at university. And in the UK, you effectively have to pick your major at 17 years old. You apply to university, you say, I want to go study 4 years of geology. So I thought, hey, why not give it a go? Let's see if I can stick this out. It seems like it's something that could have a practical outcome on the back end. I wasn't really aware of, much about the oil and gas industry or mining minerals or anything, but I just thought, it sounds like it's something that could have a practical application afterwards. And after 4 years, I was ready to get out in the world of work, and fortunately, Chemostrat was hiring. Chemostratigraphy is still, it was, especially back then, a relatively newer technique that, wasn't being taught in university. So it was very much on-the-job training, and 16 years later, I'm still doing it part-time whilst running Cambrian.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you. And Gerry, what about yourself? Can you share a bit more about what interests you about geology and how you became a geologist initially?
Sure. I think the first memory I have that probably synchronized me with geology was when my dad, I was like 5 years old, he buried a penny in our backyard and said, go dig for buried treasure. And this was in the Taconics in southern Connecticut. So there's all these nice shiny mica crystals and garnets, and the smell of the earth that resonated, and it pretty well set the tone from like age 5. I knew I was going to be somewhere in the field of geology. I didn't know the word at the time, but I think it was also the smell of the earth, which turns out to be, it's a bacteria called Mycobacterium vacui, which somehow we have receptors in our brain, and it makes us feel really good when you have that nice smell of earth. So when that happened, the template was set to go into earth science.
Nice. And farming, evidently, too. Okay, thank you.
They have some strong similarities.
Yeah, definitely. So that actually sets it up really well. So I'll stick with you, Gerry. Why don't you talk a little bit about that transition that you made from the coffee world or from the geology world into the coffee world. So if you could share a bit about that.
Well, my wife Janet and I we were in Western Canada. She had a coffee business. I was working for the Geological Survey of Canada as a field geologist and organizing a big lithoprobe project in crustal geophysics. And her parents, who lived down here in Hawaii, said to us, why don't you come down and be coffee farmers? And you don't get many opportunities in life to do that. And so we dropped we did the 5-year plan. We dropped everything we were doing and came down here to start second career as farmers, not knowing anything about what we were doing. We kind of stumbled our way through. And so now we have this organic farm where we grow coffee, cacao, vanilla, a whole array of vegetables, tropical fruit, etc., and try to use a lot of concepts from earth science, basically earth system science, that everything is linked and connected together. So we do a lot of work with compost, sustainability, generating local fertility from the waste stream, etc.
Oh, that sets up the second part of my question, which you've already answered, which was how does your experiences as an earth scientist influence how you work today, which I think you've answered that quite well. And I'll just pass it to Gemma, yourself. I mean, obviously the name of your coffee shop and, the how you describe the kind of theme. But yeah, is there anything you wanted to share about your experiences and what you bring kind of from your geoscience background?
Yeah, I mean, I have created a coffee shop called Cambrian Coffee, so I'm very lucky. My husband came along on this journey with me to create this. I mean, there's not many geological themed coffee shops out there, and some people think we're crazy, but I mean, Cambrian for me, it has kind of two meanings. It's both that geological world, but then also I was raised in the country of Wales, both North and South Wales. So the word Cambria is Latin for Wales. So it's kind of a double meaning that hits home quite nicely for being in the coffee shop every day. And it was just, I mean, I was a geologist at Chemostrat for over 10 years, seen ups and downs in the oil and gas industry, and just thought, is there anything else out there that I could potentially do while still doing part-time geology? And my husband and I, traveling across the country, visiting coffee shops in Pittsburgh and Seattle and everywhere else, it just seemed like that was the kind of place where we enjoyed being, and we wanted to create that kind of similar space here in Houston. Houston, it's not as, you know, especially like I've traveled a lot to Calgary, they've got a big coffee culture up there. Houston didn't really have that for the longest time, didn't have these kind of spaces where we could hang out and chat over coffee. So we just wanted to kind of add that to this particular part of Houston, and you know, see who'd come along for the ride and, you know, come check out our crazy dinosaur.
Yeah, and actually that leads well into my last question, which is both of you are calling in from very different areas that both have sort of their own feeling and sounds and everything. So Gemma, do you want to share? I mean, I know you've got that mural on there. Do you want to share a bit about like where you physically, like a little bit about your shop and sort of where it is, and then we'll pass to Gerry.
Yep. So Cambrian Coffee is here in Spring Branch, which is kind of, it's not quite within the loop of Houston, but it's just between the 610 and the Beltway 8. And we're just in this kind of little pocket north of I-10, which definitely didn't have any sort of specialty coffee in it before we moved here 5 years ago. So we recognized it was definitely an area that could do with it. And you'll definitely find us by Edith the Behemoth, as we like to call her. She is on the outside of our shop, and yeah, we do specialty coffee. We do baked goods inspired by my British background. And it's, you know, it's been 1.5 years now, and we've been accepted by the local neighborhood and the community, and it's been amazing.
Fantastic. And Gerry, that is not a fake background that you have. That is your lovely home in Hawaii. So do you want to talk a bit about your farm and just where you're calling in from?
Sure. So we're on the Hawaiian hotspot. We're on the island of Maui, and we're on the slopes of a Haleakala volcano at about 2,000 feet. And it's a clay-rich soil. It's very dry. It's leeward Haleakala. We only get about 20 inches of rain. We're kind of struggling through drought right now, but we get a lot of irrigation. And our family's been farming here for almost 45 years. And it's been a really interesting journey to learn about farming in a tropical environment. It's although this is kind of like paradise, there's a lot of complications that come with the fact that we don't really have winter per se, so bug issues and certain disease issues can be a problem. So we've had to do a lot of stick handling, to use a aphorism from Canada, in order to continue to produce food and good quality coffee here year after year.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I could just chat with you guys for the whole rest of the event, but we've got some great content to share and to talk about. So we're going to hear from Gemma and Gerry separately next, but I'm going to pass back to Rebecca, and you can we'll be hearing from you guys shortly again. Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. We can't hear you, Rebecca.
You guys let me go a long time before you told me that.
Wanted to see if you were going to come up with some sign language, moving your hands there.
Sorry, guys, I'm from New Jersey. It's the Italian around me that's in me. I think I said thank you so much. I'm so happy to hear about your backgrounds, and that I'm going to go ahead and pass it right back to Gerry, who's going to talk to us about the geobiology of coffee.
Okay, thanks very much. This was a real pleasure to put together. I hadn't really thought much about the connections between geology and coffee. So when I was asked to do this, I was, yeah, sure, I'll do this, and we'll see what shakes out of it. So in doing so, trying to find the connection between geology and coffee was a challenge. And I came up with something that I'm calling the geobiology of coffee, because there is a lot of biological components in it. And the second part of the title, From Plates to Cup, basically is a play on words to kind of stoke your imagination about the connection between plate tectonics and the cup of coffee that you have as you move along in life. So this is a picture of the birthplace of coffee. This is Ethiopia. This is the highlands of the Ethiopian plateau. Native forest forms an overstory, and coffee grows in the shade of the understory in lightly managed coffee plantations. And this is where it all started. So we could go to the next slide. Okay, so one of the questions we had, and this slide shows coffee flowers going through coffee cherries, which is the fruit. We extract the seed, and eventually that becomes what we roast, grind up, and brew. And the question became, is there a terroir of coffee? And terroir in the context of wine is the complete natural environment in which a wine or a coffee is produced, including elements of topography, climate, soil, the cultivar. So cultivar means different varieties of the same species. So when you see all these different varieties of lettuce, for example, it's all the same genus and species. And the same thing with coffee, as you'll see later on, there's hundreds of different cultivars, largely bred by humans, but some of them from native Ethiopia. And these all contribute to different flavor profiles. And then you also have a component of indigenous microbes, especially the yeast, which are important in not only the biology of the plant when it's alive, but also the fermentation and processing. So in the upper left, the processing, it can be natural fermentation using indigenous microbes. It could be yeast assisted. People are now getting really excited about using champagne yeast and beer yeast for the fermentation. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that, but that's, people can do what they want. You can let the skin dry onto the coffee and remove it. That's called a dried natural. These all contribute substantially to the flavor profiles that you get. The degree of roasting contributes to it. Personally, we like to have a medium roast because it gives you a better opportunity to access the actual flavors in the coffee. And the brewing method can have a really big impact on the flavor that comes out of your coffee. The next slide, please. Okay, so there's this legend that there's a shepherd around 850 AD named Kali, who noticed that his goats, this is in Ethiopia, and he noticed his goats were eating these red cherries off of a tree in the forest and then behaving in a rather energetic fashion. That's the common legend. Personally, I'm not sure that goats would do that, but I wouldn't put anything past goats. We've had goats here, and they're characters. The Hawaiian word is kalohe, which is that's a character. That's a troublemaker. Anyway, caffeine was probably developed by coffee as a way to resist or defend against herbivory or grazing. But anyway, that's the legend of how coffee came to be. If you could have the next slide, please. So coffee is native to tropical Africa. Here's the outline of Africa, shows all the different coffee varieties. There's like 90 different species of coffee. There's really just 2 that are used commercially. The high elevation one shown in the yellow pattern from southwestern Ethiopia, that's Kupa'a arabica. And then a lower elevation coffee called Kupa'a canephora or robusta. And there's all these other ones in black and white that aren't widely used. Basically, for the specialty coffee industry, any environment throughout the world that is between 20 degrees north and 20 degrees south and matches the environmental setting of south of the Ethiopian plateau is where you can grow coffee. So you could be at 2,000 feet in Hawaii, you could be at 4,000 feet in Nicaragua, etc., and you can grow specialty coffee. Can you have the next slide, please? So this is the tree of coffee. And because this is a geology talk, I did have to include one slide that's impossible for everybody to read because there's far too much information. But I believe the link to this, which you can download for those of you that really want to geek out about it, is going to be in the chat. So on the right-hand side, you'll see one branch is called C. canephora. That's Kupa'a canephora. And all the varieties on the right-hand side are Robusta varieties. And we'll talk a little bit more about those. The central trunk part of this tree has 2 major branches. The green branches where all the labels are in green, those are native Ethiopian and Sudanese coffees. One of those coffees made it to Yemen and then eventually became the orange and red patterns heading up towards the top of the tree, which are Typica and Bourbon, which account for virtually all of the specialty coffee that we grow in the world. And you'll see that we've kind of boxed ourselves in terms of genetic variability. Even though there's all these different cultivars, they ultimately came from only a few seeds that made it from Yemen to India around the 1700s. So that has some really interesting impacts on not so much flavor profiles, but resistance to disease, which is now becoming a really big deal in the coffee industry. So we could go to the next slide, please. So I'm just going to compare Arabica and Robusta. Robusta is on the left-hand side. It has a much higher yield. It has a higher caffeine content. This is typically what's used for blending, for truck stop coffee. It's commonly used for freeze-dried or instant coffee. It's what's going to give you the buzz. It has a lower sugar content. It has a bitter, woody flavor. It might account for about 40% of global production, and it grows at lower elevation. Importantly, it's resistant to a disease called coffee leaf rust, which is destroying specialty coffee throughout the world. Arabica, in contrast, has lower yield per acre, it has less caffeine, it has more sugar, so you get more diversity in the cup. It'll have acidity, fruity characteristics. It accounts for 60% of global production, grows at higher elevation, 600 to 1,500 meters, and it has limited resistance to rust, which is a huge, huge problem. The next slide, please. Okay, so here's where the geology comes in. Ethiopia is over the East African hotspot, excuse me, where there's been uplift and rifting of the East African rift. The current hotspot, the tectonic plate of Africa has been sitting over that hotspot for about 10 million years, which has caused a substantial amount of uplift in the area of Ethiopia, which is shown in the high brown topography in the top part. So the Ethiopian plateau owes its origin to first order plate tectonics, which is why you get the plates to cup connection. So the birthplace of coffee comes from the Ethiopian plateau. And environments that do not match that cannot support the growth of specialty coffee very well. We could go to the next slide. A lot of people wonder about the role of soil in affecting the flavor profiles that you see in coffee. One of the things that I did when I first moved down here 20 years ago, being a former geologist, I wanted to know what minerals and what chemistry was in our soil. So this little figure shows cations on the bottom, weight percent on the left. I took a USGS analysis of Kula series basalt, which is what we live on, and had one of our soils, Kupa'a soil, which is what we farm in, analyzed by University of New Mexico. And you can see that a large number of the major cations are depleted as you go from the green dots to the orange dots. So actually our soil isn't very rich in particular elements, and the viability of it and the character of it is controlled to a large degree by the biology and what sort of mineral amendments and fertilizers we add. And this is a common theme that you see throughout the world because coffee generally grows in tropical, subtropical areas. There's going to be a lot of rainfall. Most of these soils are pretty leached. So not unlike wine, there's a big controversy about whether or not individual soil profiles have much of an impact on coffee flavor. The next slide, please. So the spread of coffee is really interesting. What you can see in the middle in the Ethiopian plateau before 1400, coffee made it from the Ethiopian plateau to Yemen, and then a small number of seeds were actually smuggled from Yemen into India, and then made it with Dutch traders into the Sulawesi area of the Western Pacific, and then made it to Amsterdam, where they were grown in a greenhouse. And then from that limited gene pool, that made it over to the New World, into the Caribbean and parts of South America. So it was 3 coffee seeds or something like that that contribute all the genetics to millions of acres of New World coffee. And that's a real problem in terms of the long-term sustainability of coffee because of its lack of disease resistance. The orange coffee is the Canephora or Robusta, which also made it to Europe and then was dispersed over to lower elevation areas, both in the New World and in parts of the Western Pacific. So there's a really strong human imprint in terms of transporting the geologic component of coffee from Ethiopia around the world. The next slide, please. So any place where you get an environment that mimics the Ethiopian forests, so the combination of climate, rainfall, elevation, and shade, you can grow specialty coffee. This is an example from Guatemala with shade trees shading young coffee trees underneath them, which is how we grow our coffee as well. And that contrasts with other ways in which humans grow coffee. You could show the next slide, please. Which is, this is mechanically harvested modern plantation coffee in parts of Brazil. It's easy to harvest, but you can see that the flavor profile of this coffee is going to be impacted by the diversity of microbial life, animal life, bird life associated with what would be the native environment of coffee. So there's a real contrast between so-called sun-grown industrialized coffee here and shade-grown forested coffee, as you saw in the previous slide. Next slide, please. So this is our conclusion. These beautiful coffee cherries are a yellow Bourbon, which is an heirloom variety. It's not widely grown. We grow it. It's come in really high, both in statewide and international cupping competitions. It's a beautiful coffee to pick. We love, you know, all of our coffee is hand-picked. So specialty coffee worldwide, Coffea arabica, owes its origin to continental uplift associated with the East African rift that formed the Ethiopian plateau, which is the perfect environment for growing coffee and is the birthplace of specialty coffee. So you can grow specialty coffee in environments that match the climatic topographic characteristics of the Ethiopian plateau. The terroir of coffee, much like wine, owes its origin to the complex interplay of biology both above and below ground and during fermentation, and climate and environment that creates an ideal setting for healthy coffee. So thank you very much. Hopefully I didn't gobble up too much time here.
Absolutely not. I know I enjoyed everything that you shared. And now we're going to have a quick chance to have some questions, or one, maybe two from the audience. And Dan is going to help us out with that. Dan, you want to go ahead and turn your video on?
Can you facilitate my video?
I'm not quite sure how
Can
to.
you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Well, I do have two very good questions. The first one's for Gerry. Gerry, which cultivars do you grow in Hawaii?
Oh, that is a really good question. Most of the coffee that's grown in Hawaii is called Typica, and it originally made it here from Guatemala around 1813 to 1825. That's what's most commonly grown in Kona, but there's other coffee farms, small and large, that are growing new cultivars, such as Red Catuai, which is a Brazilian coffee. It has a lot of mouthfeel, very chocolatey. Yellow Catuai, we grow that one. Bourbon is grown. So we're starting to see a much bigger diversity of coffee grown both on our farm, but also in Hawaii in general.
Excellent. Thank you. The next question is really for both of you. It comes from Tiffany, who asks, is fermentation always performed during the pre-roast?
Yes, it is. It's not always done. If you do what's called a dry natural, there's no fermentation involved. If you do, basically fermentation is to remove the mucilage layer on the outside of the coffee seed. So after you remove the pulp, the cherry colored yellow or red part, you have this layer of mucilage. You can remove that mechanically. You can let some of it dry to produce a honeyed coffee. I think Gemma is going to talk about that. Or you can use fermentation to actually remove that pulp. It's a combination of yeast and enzymes like pectinase that remove that mucilage. And you want to remove that ultimately because it gives you a nice stable, what's called parchment form of coffee. It's not susceptible to post-harvest mold, etc. You have something you can stick in a warehouse for months and it'll be stable, won't get moldy.
Thank you.
Thanks. We're going to move on for the purposes of time, but one quick thing. Gerry, could you repeat the name of your company? Some inquiring minds want to know.
Oh, okay. The name of the company is called Kupa'a. You'll see there's a little akina or an accent between the two A's, and that's a guttural stop. So Kupa'a means in Hawaiian to make firm. And so that's the name of our farm, Kupa'a Farms.
Thank you so much. So like I said, we're going to pause the questions for now, but we do have time for questions with both panelists again at the end of the event. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Gerry. That was a great lecture. As a quick pseudo intermission, we want to just take a quick moment to let you all know how to join the AAPG Women's Network and the Association for Women Geoscientists. Please do consider going to this QR code and filling out the form so that you could be on our email listservs. That way you can receive information about our upcoming events, including future geology of events. And now for the AWG, someone will be dropping a link in the chat, or you can just Google the Association for Women Geoscientists and you can find how to join. There's a lot of text on this slide because we have a lot of events coming up. I won't talk about every individual one, but we do have a lot of events occurring at Image, which is the joint AAPG and SEG conference occurring in a few weeks in Houston. Somebody on the committee will be dropping in the chat a link to a summary of the events that we have. Most of those events are co-hosted between the AAPG Women's Network and the AWG and also the SEG Women's Network. So if you're in Houston, please come check out these events. At the end of September, the AAPG Women's Network and AWG are also co-hosting a book discussion on Gaslighted. That will be both in person in Houston with the author of the book and virtual. So please check that out. There's advertisement information on the AWG Lone Star Chapter's Facebook page. Finally, keep checking our advertisements frequently. We are planning a Geology of Whiskey event, which will be virtual, and that should occur probably early 2023. I will just throw out there, if you know any geology whiskey experts, please contact us and get us in touch with them. And we're also going to start having some in-person geology of events. Those will be occurring in different places, largely in Houston, where a lot of our participants live. So keep your eyes peeled for that. And always go to our YouTube channel to check out our past events, such as the Geology of Wine, the Geology of Beer, and also the Geology of Wine and Cheese. I'm gonna pass it off to Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Hey, this is Dan Kelleher from Midwest Geosciences Group. I want to say thanks to AAPG Women's Network and the Association of Women Geoscientists. There's a lot of geologists, geoscientists, engineers on this event, and this one is really tailored to the ones who work in the environmental and the engineering industry. Next slide, please, Rebecca. One of the important descriptive elements on our boring logs are soil classifications. Midwest Geosciences Group has been working on a brand new soil kit called the Soil Classification Exam Kit. Whether you use the unified system, the USDA, or if you're a highway engineer doing AASHTO or Wentworth scale or the Burmeister, this particular kit has 18 different samples that have been classified 5 different ways. But when you get the kit, you don't know what the classifications are until you test yourself, log into the website, and then get the answers. It's very unique and it really is a fantastic tool. The only place to get information on it right now is that QR code that you see on your screen. So I want to put a plug in for that and promote it. That thing will become available in 2 weeks. The distribution date for that is the last week in August. Thanks, Rebecca. Thanks, everybody, for letting me announce that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for all the support with all of our events. So now we are going to get ready for our second tasting. So if you didn't have a chance to brew your coffee earlier, or you are just dying to have some more coffee brewed, this is the time that you can get some more coffee brewed. And we're also going to play the video pre-made by Cambrian Coffee that shows some home brewing techniques. Now, if you are interested in watching this video again in the future, it is available on the AAPG Women's Network's YouTube channel. And that link has been dropped in the chat. Alternatively, if you just Google AAPGW on YouTube, it is the first hit. All right, now I'm going to reshare my screen again so that we can all watch the video together.
Hi, I'm Brian from Cambrian Coffee, and today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about brewing some coffee at home. You may have received one of these in the mail. This is a packet of 2.5 ounces of ground coffee, already pre-ground for you. This is a popular one around our shop. This is the Ethiopia Sidama Organic. This is a single origin from Ethiopia. It's going to give you a lot of those like blueberry, lemon, lighter, fruitier flavors that you'll find in some of the African coffees. We are going to go over just a few different methods that can maybe up your home coffee game. The 3 methods I want to talk to you a little bit about would be a French press. A lot of you have seen these. We also have a Hario V60 and a Kula wave. Starting first on the French press, this is going to replicate a really good drip cup of coffee. It's nice, it's big, it can make you at least a couple cups you can share with somebody. It makes a really nice smooth cup. For this grind size, you're going to be looking at probably like a medium to a coarser grind. And basically, you are going to measure out your coffee, you're going to put it in there, and the whole idea behind this is once you add your hot water, you are going to let it brew, and then at the end, you actually force the water away from the grinds that are at the bottom and have your coffee in this area right here using a filter pushing down on them. Really nice, really popular. People really like this method for home brewing. These 2 methods look very similar, but they actually couldn't be much more different. This is going to be your Hario V60 and your Kula wave. These are both Japanese methods. Again, look very, very similar from the outside, but when you look inside, that's where you're really going to see the difference. This Hario V60, for example, has a swirl pattern in it and a very large hole at the bottom. That is going to put the water very quickly through the grinds. The Hario V60 is going to make you a cup that tastes very clean, juicy, full of more like fruity notes, pulling a lot of the fruity notes because it goes through the grinds a little more quickly. The Hario V60, on the other hand, the Kula wave is going to have the ripples on the inside. That's going to slow your water down, and it's only going to go through these 3 little holes at the bottom. So that water is going to sit on those grinds a little bit longer. It may cover up some of the crazy fruity aspects, but it's going to give you much more body. Slower flow rate is going to give you more complexity and get more body to that cup. So really, of all these 3 methods, everybody has different opinions, different people are fans of different ones. They're all 3 great, just all a little bit different, all pair well with different types of beans. Talk about grind size. This is going to be, again, more medium to coarse grind. If you have a really good grinder at home, that's probably one of the most important tools you can have, or you can take whole beans to some coffee shops will grind them for you. You just tell them what to use this for. The V60 is kind of in between these 2. It's more of a medium grind, very similar to drip coffee. And then this guy right here, the Kula wave, is going to be finer, almost a table salt grind. That's going to be really fine. It's also worth mentioning, whereas this one has a filter built into it, these 2 actually have their own filters that fit these perfectly. The Kula Wave is going to have what looks like just a small regular coffee filter that drops into it. The Gery V60 is going to have a nice conical, very popular filter that can actually be folded over and opened up and placed inside it like that. As I mentioned, you may have had some of this Ethiopia Sidama dropped off at your door. This is pre-ground for kind of a more fine grind, and for this particular exercise, we're going to run it through the Kula Wave. I would recommend you getting a nice gooseneck kettle, but you can use any hot kettle you have. The better the kettle, the more you're going to be able to really dial in the temperature. Temperature is also another big factor when it comes to brewing your coffee. People choose different temperatures, anywhere between like 199 and 205 degrees. Some people say 202 is perfect. It really just depends. You can play around with grind size, with temperature, all those things to get the perfect cup. So what would keep you from getting a perfect cup? There are two major things that can really mess things up for you, and they are under extraction and over extraction. If you under extract your coffee, you may find that you're getting a more sharp or sour taste. That means under extracting means you didn't pull enough out of the coffee, the water went through it more quickly. Over extraction means it sat on a little bit too long. Thinner body, maybe hollow flavors, not really picking up what you think you should out of the coffee. Those are your two big things you want to look out for. They can vary based on the time, method, and temperature that you use. So, for this demonstration, we're going to make coffee on the Kula Wave method. You probably don't have one of these in your house, but we find it really helpful over here when we get in a hurry. It replaces a traditional gooseneck kettle or a kettle for adding the water. We actually program this to have several infusions of the hot water perfectly dialed into the right temperature over our grounds. So what we're going to do for this, we're going to make 1 cup of coffee. So we're going to go ahead and measure out 25 grams of the beans you were sent. Again, that's already pre-ground. We get that to where we're happy. And right about there. We're at 25 grams right there. We can smell, that's always nice. And what we're going to do before we start is, I mentioned you have that nice filter in here. You're going to go ahead and wash some hot water through that filter before you do anything else, because that is going to not only prepare the filter, but it's also going to wash out any tiny little flavors that might be in that that paper filter. It's nice to give it a good soak of hot water first, and then also it's getting maybe that super hot or not as hot water that's stuck there at the beginning of the kettle ready for it. So do that guy. Then we're going to go ahead and add our coffee grounds right on top. We're going to go ahead and place that on there, see how that works. And you're going to see your first infusion of water on top of those grinds. And that first infusion is going to create in the coffee what we call the bloom. That'll soak those grounds. You might see them puff up. They're actually releasing any additional gases that are left over in the coffee beans. A lot of it will escape once it's been ground, but the rest of it will actually puff up as it soaks in the water and releases all those other gases. We call that the bloom. Actually makes a really nice smell as well. So then again, this is simulating what you would be doing with a gooseneck kettle. It's just going to do it for you. That is your first major infusion of hot water that we've programmed to go over the grinds. That's going to continue on for the better part of about 3 minutes and approximately 4 more infusions of water into those grinds. And there you go. Now's the fun part. Enjoying the payoff of all that hard work. Suggest black, but again, we never judge. Great. We hope you enjoyed this, And if you ever find yourself in Houston, Texas, please stop by and say hello. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Brian. All right. Now back to our slides. Gemma, you want to go ahead and take it away?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Rebecca. So this is kind of, harping back to what we were talking about before and talking about the natural coffee flavor profiles. And so, even if you're only vaguely familiar with coffee, you've heard things like chocolatey, nutty, fruity, can get floral, earthy, and then there's those sugar notes that I was talking about before. And so these are kind of all very generic terms, but as the next slide will show, you can actually get into it in a very detailed level. And so this is called the Coffee Taster's Flavor Wheel, originally published 27 years ago now. But basically you start from the center, and then the further that you work your way out, you get to kind of a more specific flavor profile. And before I kind of show that with relation to the berries, if we just skip to the next slide, for all the geologists out there, when I first saw this coffee flavor wheel, it very much reminded me of the geological timescale. And here the international chronostat chart, and just, there's obviously only so many colors to use. And when you break things down into as many categories as you're doing with either coffee flavors or geological timescale, you've obviously got to use kind of the whole rainbow of colors. So I just thought that one was pretty neat to, connect the dots between geology and coffee. And so then the next slide will show how, when you get down to the very specific levels, like I say, you start at the center of the coffee flavor wheel. And so you say, okay, I'm tasting some fruit notes. Okay, what kind of fruit notes are we tasting? Are we tasting berries, or are we tasting citrus notes? Within that berry section, is it a darker berry like a blackberry? Is it a blueberry or a strawberry note? Or on the citrus end, are you tasting more lemon lime flavors, or oranges, perhaps even all the way up to grapefruit? And so this is kind of the level of detail you can get into when you're tasting that coffee, and just really trying to pinpoint the very subtle flavor profiles that you can come up with. And so, as we've kind of already discovered with our comparison of Colombian and Ethiopian coffee, there is a difference. There seems to be a difference based on where you are and the country of origin. And so that's what our next slide is going to show, is that, Gerry was talking earlier about,
yeah, I think first we planned to take a look at what people thought.
Oh yeah, a review of the results from the Mentimeter. And that was, like I say, everybody was kind of along the right lines there with picking up those kind of blueberry lighter notes from Ethiopian versus the kind of more darker chocolatey nutty notes.
So at this point, I think Stefano is going to share the screen and take another look at that. Now that we're all a little more educated on what types of flavors we can taste in our coffee, let's go back and see what we thought before we were this educated.
And so, yeah, we've got those chocolate, earthy, the acidic notes, caramel. And again, you can see there, we just said, fruity or fruit has just popped up. And so, yeah, you can start with fruity and then maybe start to pinpoint what kind of fruits are you tasting in that specific Colombian coffee that we have. And the same goes for the Ethiopian. And you can see they're full flavored on the Colombian as well. Definitely picking up that kind of deeper, richer flavor.
All right, now I'm going back to the slides. There we go.
Cool. So then, yeah, as Gerry was talking about earlier, you've kind of got this zone around the world where coffee is kind of at its peak growing conditions, also known as the coffee belt. But even along that belt, you can break down the flavor profiles based on where those beans are coming from. So again, in the specialty coffee world, we start talking about single origin beans. So you can get blends of beans, and those are used for, drip coffees, kind of a more kind of generic brew method. But if you want to actually then start to get more nuanced flavors, you start honing in on a single region. So if you're in Colombia or the Americas as a whole, like you've got a more mild and balanced, nutty, spicy profile and a kind of more mild acidity. compared to those that you get from Africa, a lot brighter, a lot more acidic notes. Those fruits definitely come through a lot more in those African coffees. And then you've got the ones from Asia, which are definitely hitting that kind of heavy body, kind of earthy, chocolatey notes. And so again, it all comes down to personal preference as to where people, what kind of flavor profiles people are looking for. But you can then generally break them down into these 3 regions. And so that's why there was such a contrast between the Ethiopian and the Colombian. And so, that's kind of like the overall pattern. And even within that, like, there are things that can change. So if we see on the next slide, variations in crops between years can have more pronounced flavors than others. For the last year or so, the coffees coming out of Colombia actually had a lot more fruity notes than I think a lot of people anticipated. I'm still not sure why they were coming out with more fruitier notes this year compared to previous ones. But it's, from a scientist perspective, it's something to look into. Was there any sort of changes in local conditions that would perhaps enhance that? And then the degree of roasting can also impact the end result. And I know that was a question that somebody came up with in the chat a little earlier, was, the kind of lighter roasts, you'll get that kind of more milk chocolate flavor notes coming through. Whereas in the heavier ones, you'll get that dark chocolate cacao, and you may lose those more nuanced flavors. You may start to lose some of those more subtle berry flavors if you roast the coffee to, a higher level. And so, that's kind of talking about variations even within a region, variations based on roasting. But then there is still the issue of how those beans, what's done to those beans before they even get into your hands. And so we can see this on the next slide. Coffee processing is the process what happens to the coffee cherries before they are bagged up as green beans and sent to roasters. And so you have 3 main coffee processing methods, which Gerry's already intimated to a couple of these, but you've got the natural process, which is called the dry process. You've got a wet or wet milled process, and then you've got a pulp natural or a honey process. And so this first slide here is looking at the natural process. And this is basically taking those coffee cherries, whole as they are, with the coffee, the pulp, the mucilage, the meat of the coffee cherry itself, because the bean is the seed inside, and just basically putting them out onto raised beds to dry, and almost like a raisin, and fully intact in the sun. And this is kind of a more common method used in places like Africa, where any available clean water is kept for drinking. That's the good water. We don't want to use water to kind of process all these coffee cherries to remove the fruit from the bean. And so this is why things like the Ethiopian coffees and those from other parts of Africa, you get kind of that more fruity note coming through, the dark berry end, the blueberries, blackberries, and then the more tea-like flavors, because you are just basically, drying that bean in natural conditions and just allowing that flavor, that lighter flavor to permeate through. Whereas the next slide shows one that involves a lot more water, and it's a lot of water. You basically put these coffee cherries into big vats of water, and just initially just to sort them. The more dense, heavy cherries sink to the bottom, and the ripe, the unripe, less dense or defective ones float to the top, and they can be skimmed away and not used for processing into actual green coffee beans. And then the cherries are depulped mechanically and placed into a fermentation tank to remove that mucilage that Gerry was talking about earlier. And then they go out in the sun to dry. So they've removed, like I say, most of that cherry meat off of the bean. And so it's a very quick and efficient method. That's the kind of the one pro of it. But, a con is that it is, environmentally wasteful. You use a lot of water consumption, and you need an incredible amount of infrastructure, technology, energy, which isn't as readily available in places like Africa, which is why, they kind of tend to stick to the more natural process. And then the resulting flavors from this washed wet process, that's where you're getting those classic caramel, chocolate, nutty flavors, some citrus notes coming through, because you are kind of removing that pulp, but then fermenting them with that mucilage still on to kind of really enhance some of that stronger flavor notes. And so then the third process on the next slide is the pulped natural or the honey process. And so this is kind of it's a hybrid between the natural and the washed. So you don't necessarily remove everything from the beans. And so you still got that kind of mucilage left on the bean. And then depending on how much mucilage you have can then vary as to what kind of color result that you come out with. You can see this honey process goes from white honey all the way to black honey, where they've still got some of that, a lot more of that mucilage on it, with a darker color and a longer drying time, to basically have a very different flavor profile than what you'd have from the white honey process. So these are all things that can affect the flavor of the coffee, you know, in a very natural way. Like I say, again, we're not kind of putting synthetic flavors on these beans, but this is the natural kind of processing, fermentation of the beans before they are then roasted. And so these are all things that can affect the coffee profile flavor, the natural coffee profile flavor. And I think it's the next slide, my final one. And yeah, it's just a case of, as I've shown, like, you know, if you prefer those kind of darker, you know, kind of more well roasted but chocolatey nutty flavors, then those are the ones from either Asia or from the Americas. If you like those fruity tea-like notes, and it is remarkable how you know, it is a very different change in the body of the coffee. It does drink thinner, it does drink lighter as a tea compared to a coffee. And then, as Brian showed, it can also, how you brew that coffee can change, because a Kalita will brew you a more heavy body than a V60. So you can also, you know, change your flavor experience based on how you brew that coffee. And that's the fun part of coffee. It can, you know, you could take one bean and brew it a different number of ways and see how many different flavor profiles you are able to get out of that based on, you know, the extraction time of the coffee itself. But it's about traveling the world, tasting the coffee. You know, the last few years have obviously been very difficult with the pandemic, but hey, we can still travel the world by tasting all these different beans that are available, you know, right on our doorstep, whether it be in the supermarkets or in specialty coffee shops.
Thank you so much, Gemma. And I definitely plan to be traveling the world via coffee tasting. You've inspired me. All right, at this point, we're going to have some Q&A with the panelists. We have received a number of questions in the Q&A box and also within the chat. And so I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that we can just focus on our panelists and Dan, who is going to lead the Q&A. Take it away, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you, Rebecca. We have several questions. One is from Bill, who asks, can you malt coffee?
That's an interesting one. I've never been asked that or come across that as any kind of a question. How about you, Gerry?
Mulled coffee. Well, I guess it would be almost a form of cold brew. I don't know if you would want to heat it up, like slow heating. That seems like extended heating and long-term extraction would bring out some of the less desirable components in a roasted coffee bean.
Well, still a good question, Bill, and he has some more. This one comes from Christina, who asks, is there really such thing as a prune flavored coffee?
I mean, yes. I mean, again, the stone fruits can come in, whether you're talking about nectarines, plums, anything like that. So, you know, a dried version of that, if that's something that you're picking out of the coffee, it wouldn't be just the prune flavor that would come through, but I can definitely appreciate. We have one in our shop right now from where's it from? I think it's from El Salvador, and to me, it tastes like raisins. I have it as a flat white coffee with a hint of vanilla syrup, and it tastes like I'm drinking a nice cup of raisins. And I know raisins is not for everybody. If some of my friends are listening here, I know those that absolutely detest raisins, but I'm definitely getting that kind of rich note out of that particular coffee.
Thank you. The next one is from Diana, who asks, is there a chemical or a geologic connection to coffee taste? Is there anything in the soil that gives a fruity or any kind of specific taste?
I would say that has yet to be determined, whether or not there's something specific in the soil that contributes to flavor. There's a lot of work that's being done on coffee beans, and most of the flavor comes from what are called secondary metabolites that the plant produces that are actually part of its immune system. So if you have a really healthy plant that has all the elements in the soil that it needs to stoke its immune system, you get a lot of secondary metabolites. And so you have a lot of interesting flavor potential there. And then it's up to the processors and roasters and the home brewers to actually capture those flavor profiles. But in terms of saying that, most of the tropical soils are pretty depleted in a lot of the micronutrients. And some farms are actually using foliar applications of copper and zinc and boron and stuff like that to try to enhance the health of coffee. And then it's basically the characteristics of the cultivar that contribute more to the flavor than it is a specific element in the soil, or at least that's my understanding so far. It's not an open and shut case by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, very good. The next question comes from David. Is it true that there's a flavor loss after 2 or 3 weeks following roasting?
There is the degassing process. After you roast beans, you do need to give them a bit of time to release the rest of their gases. And I wouldn't even necessarily call that a flavor loss. We almost like to allow those beans to degas a little further to actually enhance the natural flavor of the beans themselves. So that's even when we get, everybody likes to have, the freshest roasted coffee they can. We actually like to have, depending on the bean and where it's come from, we like to have those beans perhaps sit around for a little while to finish degassing before we then brew that coffee. You can speed up that degassing process by grinding the coffee. But the minute you grind beans, you are starting to experience a loss of flavor and caffeine in those beans anyway. So starting from whole beans is always best if possible. But yeah, there is that degassing process, which I think can actually enhance rather than negate the coffee beans.
Excellent. Okay. The last question I have here in the queue at this point is from Cecilia, who asks, does the acidic pH degree of rain in Ethiopia make much of a difference in growing the coffee compared to Colombia?
I would say, from my limited knowledge, the pH of rainwater is strongly buffered by components within the soil, so it wouldn't make that much of an effect on the pH of the soil itself or the rhizosphere, which is the area of biology growing around the roots of the plant. If the pH is extreme, either alkaline or acidic, it will definitely affect the leaves and the biology on the leaves, but you'd have to be in some place with pretty serious acid rain to make a difference, like what used to happen in Sudbury, Ontario with the nickel mines there.
Excellent, thank you. Another quick question off the sideline is, has anybody ever calculated the carbon footprint of a cup of coffee?
I'm pretty sure that there's a couple of people that have worked on that. There's, I'd have to go back and look. Paul Hawken, the natural capitalist, had done work with a fellow from Rhode Island that had a coffee company there. They were trying to look, this is like 15, 20 years ago, they were looking at the overall footprint of coffee production, because it's kind of staggering when you think about the amount of water that's used, the transportation, jute bags. I think something that we haven't mentioned here that those of you in the petroleum industry would certainly appreciate: coffee is the second most traded commodity in the world behind petroleum. So it's going to have a pretty significant carbon footprint simply because of transportation, if nothing else. Interesting.
Along those same lines, you just mentioned about the water that it requires to make coffee. Can you share some insights about the volume of water to produce coffee?
I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but what Gemma mentioned about differences in processing, controlling water usage, in Costa Rica, they were contaminating, like 15, 20 years ago, they were in the midst of contaminating a lot of their drinking water by getting rid of fermentation water into river systems. And they were the pioneers to develop a mechanical demucilage system so that they use about 95% less water for processing their coffee. And I think people are always looking along those lines to decrease the amount of water that's used. From the agronomic perspective, when you have shade protecting your coffee, you don't get as much evapotranspiration. So shade-grown coffee uses less water than, say, full sun plantations.
Okay. Dan has shared a question.
And then we are going to have to move on pretty soon.
Okay, well, we could wind this down after this question, Rebecca. How's that?
Sounds great.
Kopi Luwak. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Have you guys heard of that before?
Yeah.
What is that? Is that a myth?
Yeah. No.
I don't know what it means. I might have been duped.
Okay, so it's a Sumatran coffee in which the coffee cherries are fed to a civet, which is a type of animal, and they actually do the removal of the pulp during digestion, and then the coffee is picked out of what comes out of the back end of the civet, and that's the Kupa'a luwak. People are trying to do that with elephants in Thailand too.
Well done. Thank you, both of you.
Thank you, Dan, for wonderfully fielding all those questions. We really appreciate it. And everybody, if your question wasn't answered or if you have more, we do have an informal networking with the panelists after this event, which will occur in about 7 minutes. But before we get to that, we'd like to share the results from the Menti questions earlier. So I'm going to go ahead and let Stefano share his screen. And Stefano, you can also turn your video on if you want and talk to us about what these results look like.
Sure. So I apologize. I'm not as ready as I thought I was. All right. So first one is the map of where our participants are calling in from. So one thing I mentioned in the chat is that we have 11 hours of time zones represented between Hawaii and Scotland. So that's pretty cool. In terms of the US distribution, Texas is pretty strong with a lot of AAPG members. California close by, or about half, and then you can see people in the Northeast. Dan, I'm surprised that Indiana isn't as high as it normally is. Maybe your neighbors in Illinois have called in instead. So this is we've got 36 different states represented and 7 different countries. So very cool. And now, let's bring this over. This is the word cloud of, yeah, the map does a better job of explaining. This is going into what people think will influence the geology of coffee. Here, soil, acidity, elevation, yep. Good stuff in there. See, favorite roast. Wow, I'm in a very low minority who actually likes flavored coffee, but it seems like we've got medium and dark roasts leading the pack.
I like a light roast, good light roast. Mm-hmm.
Let's see, countries. Colombia probably would have been bigger if I can account for the spelling difference. But yeah, Colombia is real strong. Brazil, Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Guatemala, yeah, real big. I guess United States, Hawaii is probably blended into that because I put in Hawaii. So yeah, USA, Hawaii, that comes in a couple different places. So sorry, Menti just kind of puts them all together. It doesn't really lump them logically. And then, let's see, how are people making coffee? Lots of drip users, French plungers, I'm guessing between French press or an AeroPress. Pot also popular, and then there's some cold brew and espresso people. So these are the anticipated flavors. So I think we saw these in the results. Lots of
A lot of chocolate.
acidity, earthy, nutty. There's some berry in there. And if we follow Gemma's hierarchy, we've got berry and then, blueberry smaller and other things in here as well. It's berries.
I like some of the smaller ones. Someone wrote burnt toast.
Yeah.
You're probably not drinking very good coffee.
Leathery, green apple.
I like that someone wrote coffee.
There we go. Appropriate. I think that's it. Yep. So the other ones we already kind of reviewed these two, so we won't go into those, but thanks everyone participating. And by the way, the Menti poll is going to be active for like another week or so. So if you saw these and realized that you didn't put in your location, go ahead and put those in. Yep, there's the QR code or the code to use there at the website. Appreciate it.
Yeah, go ahead and put them in now because we will continue to collect the results, and then I think we'll probably post the map to LinkedIn and share it with everyone. So if you didn't get a chance to fill it out, go ahead and do it now. And thank you so much to Stefano. It's probably not obvious to you all, but during the event, Stefano has been frantically working in the background to create all the things he just showed you. So he just made that map for us. So thank you so much. All right, so this is the end of our official, or at the end of the official formal part of the event. Thank you all so much for coming. If you have any additional questions, we now have a little coffee happy hour that Kat will explain how to access in 1 second, but we also are all pretty open to receiving questions. So feel free to get in touch with all of the separate organizations and the panelists. I believe the vast majority of us are pretty searchable on the internet. If not, if you're having issues getting in touch with somebody, go ahead and email aapgwn@gmail.com and we'll get you in touch with somebody. And also keep an eye out for our YouTube channel where this will be uploaded probably within a week or so. And with that, I'm going to pass it off to Kat to explain the next part of our event.
Oop, there we are. We have this networking tool that we've used for previous events called Wonder Room, and it's a lot like Zoom, except that you have a little avatar that you can pull around, and you can get together and chat with folks in a more sort of casual, interactive setting, kind of like being at a conference. And you wander from table to table, and maybe something's a little bit too intense, so you move to another table. So that's the kind of vibe that we're going for with Wonder. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we've had some folks that have found this a little bit challenging in the past, and it's quite straightforward. There's just like a couple of quick button clicks you need to do to activate it. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And the screen here is a video. And this is going to take us through it. So first of all, there is a link in the chat, hopefully, that will take you directly to our Wonder Room. So it's going to take you to a space that looks just like what you're looking at here. This is me filming myself yesterday, going through the process. So when you click on that link, which is going to look a little bit like this, you're going to go right to a Geology of Coffee getting started area. And in that area, you are going to first be asked to allow your browser to basically access your camera and mic, which thankfully is not hopefully default for you. So you just hit that little allow button up there, and basically you're going to update here. And here's me making sure that my camera works yesterday and my microphone is all on. I click next, and then if you want, you can give your avatar a quick on the fly photo, or you can enter in your name here or upload a photo. And then if you like, you can put a little bit about yourself. Maybe you're calling in from Indiana. Maybe you really like tea and not coffee. So you can put whatever you like there. And then we're going to be pushed directly into the Wonder Room. So I'll pause here just to show you what this looks like. So we got kind of two areas in the Wonder Room. We've got Espresso Yourself with Gemma. So this is where we're going to park Gemma. and we've got a coffee talk with Gerry. So here I have grabbed my husband earlier and got him to pretend to be on the call with me so I can show you what it's like. So basically, if you drag your avatar close to another person or a group of people, you'll enter their little circle, just like you're, parked around a table. And then you'll see here that I can now see Colin and I can chat with him. And we're so excited about the coffee that we're drinking. And we can have a conversation, whereas there could be other tables like over here in other rooms. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen and hope that sort of helps folks feel like they can get into the Wonder Room. So again, I would just encourage you to go ahead and click on the link that's going to be posted in the chat. Allow you to have browser permissions. You don't have to use video if you don't like. Once you're in the Wonder Room, you just use your cursor to drag your little avatar around. So on that note, I'm going to say I will see you in the Wonder Room. So hopefully folks will join us there, and we'll have Gemma and Gerry, and we can have just a casual chat about geology and coffee.
Awesome, great. Thank you so much, Kat. I did just drop this in the chat, but I will stick around here for a bit. So if you're having issues, if you leave Zoom and you're having issues with Wonder Room and you have questions, come back into the same Zoom meeting, and at least for the next 5 minutes or so, and I'll be here to try to do my best to help you. But we look forward to seeing you all there.